I will call the meeting to order. Fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. As you know, we are here discussing a matter of business that was started at the last committee meeting. We have a motion on the table, and then there was an amendment moved to that motion. That amendment, of course, was put forward by Mr. Angus. That amendment is currently being debated, and as is stated in the notice of business for today, we will pick up the debate where it left off. Just before moving on to my first speaker, I have them recorded here based on last day. But before moving on, I will just take a moment to review the protocols within this room based on health and safety. So as you'll recall, when you're at your desk or your table, by all means, you're able to have your mask off. However, if you get up from your seat and move about the room, we ask that you would put your mask back on. We also would ask that you honor the arrows that are on the floor and move in a counterclockwise direction when moving about this room. When you help yourself to a snack or coffee or other drink, please be mindful of the things that you touch with your hands. And also, please use hand sanitizer before touching items. With that, we will move on to the business of the day. Yes, Ms. Shanahan.
If we could just have the speaking order.
Sure. So the speaking order for the amendment, which is the first point of discussion today, we start off with Mr. Keurig, then go to Mr. Barrett, Mr. Angus, and then Mr. Green.
Okay. Can I be put
Mr.
on the
Fergus.
list?
Yes. Do you want to speak?
Please.
Okay. Ms. Goodrow? On the speaking list? Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, with that then, I will actually, I'll move on then to, before moving on, actually, sorry, it may be appropriate. I understand that Mr. Angus is not here, so this may be somewhat complicated. This is his amendment. However, Mr. Green is in his place. It may be appropriate at this time for you to summarize what the amendment is, if you'd like to take the floor. However, if you wish for me just to proceed, I'm happy to do that as well.
If you'll give me a moment.
I can also ask the clerk to read what she has, just to remind the committee.
Amended by adding after the words 1 week of the adoption of this order to the following: that the clerk provide these records to the Ethics Commissioner for his study, and that this committee calls upon the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
Okay. Thank you. With that, I will pass the mic to Mr. Keurig, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It is good to be able to address the committee after the meeting this past Friday, and it's good to see all of you, some of whom I've seen over the past few days in the House. So thank you very much. And, we find ourselves in a unique position here. Over the last number of weeks, I don't think it would be out of line to say that the current Liberal government has been rocked by yet another scandal. And in the context of this scandal, we have faced as a nation an unprecedented pandemic requiring tremendous actions by all levels of government that have rightfully so, provided aid to Canadians at a time when they have been in desperate need. I would state boldly that I don't think there's a person in this country, maybe not even a person in the world, that hasn't been affected in some way by COVID-19. But when you look at what provides the strength of our nation, the democracy, the foundations of who we are, we look to institutions like Parliament. We look to governments at all levels, legislatures, city halls, and expect them to work in our best interests. And unfortunately, we have seen over the last number of weeks that clearly the best interests as defined by the current government and members within that government has not been in the best interests of Canadians. There were personal ties to that. And those ties have, I mentioned the word earlier, rocked this government. And more importantly, Madam Chair and members of this committee, it has rocked the trust that Canadians expect to be able to put in their leaders, especially at a time of such unprecedented crisis. Now, when I was proud to be one of the members that signed the letter that did in fact recall this committee with a motion to try to get to the bottom of exactly what happened here. And I know there's other committees that are also doing important work. But it is key that we have these debates, these discussions, and ultimately that Canadians can get the answers that they deserve, because that trust that is required in a democracy has been shaken. A saying that I've heard often is trust is easily broken and hard to earn. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that there has been a great deal of trust that's been broken. And I know my colleague, Mr. Barrett, talked about it, and I think I'll mention at different points in time some of the other scandals that have eroded the trust that Canadians should have in their government. And I don't exaggerate when I say I hear from constituents each and every day about the fact that their trust in government has been truly shaken. And we need to do something about that. It is incumbent upon every member of this committee, every MP, quite frankly, to ensure that we do everything we can to restore the trust that has been shaken. So there's Madam Chair, what I'll do is I'll outline briefly a little bit of from my perception and informed by the hundreds and hundreds of conversations I've had with constituents over the last number of weeks, their feelings on some of the issues that we are moving through today. In fact, I had a conversation with one of the Liberal cabinet ministers, very appreciative that after a comment in question period, this was back a number of months ago, that a minister would follow up with me. And I hadn't heard back in a week or so, so I had my staff reach out to her office, and it had a number of conversations back and forth, and then that minister did in fact reach out, and I was very appreciative of that. And I think that during this crisis, all members would agree that there's been quite a bit of work that's been done together. We have shown that we can put politics aside when we are working for the best interests of Canadians. And I had a series of issues that I brought forward to this minister about various programs, people that were falling through the cracks. And one of the issues was the fact that the Canada Summer Jobs Grant, I had, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but hundreds of applicants, last-minute applicants to the Canada Summer Jobs Grant. And that program, all of us as MPs have had experience with that program in a way that sees true benefit to our communities, and especially during a time like we find ourselves in now. A lot of when the government adjusted some of their rules, I quite frankly was optimistic that there'd be the ability for that program to get and benefit the organizations, small businesses, municipalities in my community, and the more than 60 self-governing municipalities across my beautiful constituency. And that minister said something that at the time I shared that I wasn't sure that was going to work, but that minister mentioned that instead of making the Canada Summer Jobs Grant larger, there was this new program that had at that point just recently been announced. It was going to take the place of it. And I shared my concerns about that, especially in a rural constituency where quite a few of the organizations that were applying for the Canada Summer Jobs Grant would have involved a student either moving or having to commute that would have incurred costs. And a volunteer incentive, although we encourage volunteerism, and throughout this crisis, we've seen an incredible level of volunteerism, whether it be helping out neighbors. You know, I've seen many, many stories come through my constituency office of just showcasing the best of what Canada is all about. But that this was meant to be kind of a replacement or complement of the Canada Summer Student Grant was meant to be kind of a replacement to the Canada Summer Jobs Grant. And although I shared my concerns, of course, the minister said that she would note those, and that was the end of the conversation. And I do give credit for the fact that the minister did reach out to a member of the opposition to deal with concerns with a number of the government programs. So then we fast forward to when this program was announced. And we ended up getting, like all MPs I'm sure did, the information about how people should apply. And we started sharing some of that information with folks who had asked us to keep them updated and whatnot. But then it started to smell. And it's unfortunate that would be the case, because this program, well-intended or not, was meant to benefit students. It started to smell. And we saw over the course of a number of weeks some incredibly troubling revelations that the government had brought forward a program with an organization that was maybe not even capable of managing that program, that there were close connections to the Prime Minister himself and his family. Now, I would take a moment here to note that the allegation made by the members opposite, a number of them at which we heard at length, and although there are a few different members there today, was that somehow it was the goal of the opposition to go on a witch hunt, was one of the terms used, to drag the Prime Minister's mother or brother or whatever the case was before this committee. Well, I would hope that since the last meeting, the members opposite would have actually read the motion and the letter that called this committee back, because it had nothing to do with bringing the Prime Minister's mother or family members before this committee. But it does have to do with that issue that I referenced in the beginning of trust of our institutions. And when you're the Prime Minister and are afforded all of the authority associated with that high office in our Dominion, it comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. And certainly Conservative members don't want to see family members of politicians drugged before this. However, we do expect that the members, that a high office holder in this land, whether a minister, like the finance minister, and the very troubling allegations that have just recently come out, or the prime minister himself, or quite frankly, any of us, if there are connections that cause a shaking of the trust in our democratic institutions, then Canadians deserve answers. We all run for office, as was clearly articulated on the other side, not to get our family members involved in the political battles that take place in the capital. However, when those who hold offices make decisions that whether they involve those family members or not, scrutiny needs to be applied. And the numbers that, in fact, I'll reference a senior that called my office who had not yet received the GIS, noted to me how $300,000 was worth more than their home and was more than that they had ever made in any particular year throughout their entire life. And how frustrated they were that it seemed to them that Liberal politicians were just in it for themselves and those closely connected to them. And that's where it comes back again to the shaking of trust. And that is something, again, like I referenced before, trust is easy to break but hard to earn. And I would go as far as to suggest that we need to be very, very diligent, that we move forward in a way that helps restore that trust to Canadians. So I want to get to the amendment at hand, because I think that Canadians, we have to be willing to work diligently to ensure that we have that clear understanding. Because as we've moved forward with the scandal, we saw each and every day, it seems, that there was a new revelation. The Prime Minister's apology after it was revealed, the dollars involved and his family members involved, that we had questions about who authorized this and where the money was going, and what seemed like almost a Ponzi scheme of referrals and references and various aspects of what happened to move forward, and then we see very, very clearly that lack of transparency throughout the entire system. There's been a breaking of trust. So when we have the opportunity, all of us, as members of Parliament, members of this committee, to bring clarity and to help restore that trust that Canadians expect in their institutions, I think we need to do everything we can to ensure that light is shone, that answers are found, and that we have a clear objective to demonstrate to all Canadians that we are doing what's in their best interests, that it's not for our personal benefit that we have put our names on a ballot, that we come to the capital to debate the pressing issues of our land, but that it is for Canadians' best interests. So the amendment, Madam Chair, I think is important to differentiate the conversation that led up to that. And I would actually move a sub-amendment. So if the clerk would indulge me, and I do apologize that my French is not good enough to assist in that. But I would just like to add two words to ensure that, as I've outlined, that trust issue, that we have a clear ability to shine light in everything that's happened in this scandal, to ensure that light is shone. So the sub-amendment that I would move is that after provide the records to and then I would add committee and the Ethics Commissioner, so that we can move forward in ensuring that Canadians get answers on this ever evolving. In fact, I find it quite staggering. And Madam Chair, I'm a fairly new member of Parliament, and it's been certainly an interesting and educational number of months to have first been elected. But it has impressed upon me the importance of our institutions, that we get to the bottom of all aspects of this. So, with that, I have certainly much more that I would love to say, and I did mention that I'll get to some of the testimony that we heard, because I took fairly detailed notes, as it was more like a university class, I felt like, last week, and I must reference the Latin specifically. I admit I did not study Latin, but I did study Greek and Hebrew, two other dead languages. Now, Greek in terms of the ancient Greek, so now I studied it. That doesn't mean I remember much of it, but certainly there is much more that I have that I could say. But my final comment, and is there any additions that I need to make in terms of the amendment to the sub-amendment?
Well, I'd like to clarify with you.
Sure. So it's my understanding that the amendment is that the clerk provide the records to the ethics commissioner, right, is how it stands now. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. So I would add a sub-amendment, and I hope that I can find support, quite frankly, from every member of this committee on this issue. But certainly members of the opposition, who I think we're all united in this. But I would add simply after that I would add committee and, 2 words. The ethics commissioner.
Mr. Keurig, if I may, the motion that the clerk is working with is just slightly different than what you stated. Sure. So if I may just hit pause here for just a moment, I'll allow the clerk to come and confer with you and just make sure that we have the wording down before we continue.
I would be happy to confirm and confer.
Okay.
Confer and confirm.
Right now, it looks like this.
Okay.
So I will officially suspend for 2 minutes. All right, so having resumed, Mr. Keurig, maybe I'll just have you clarify your sub-amendment.
Just to make sure that everything's in order with what the most accurate text is, that it would be to the members of the committee. So not 2 words, but 4 words. Members of the committee and the ethics commissioner. Is that?
Mr. Keurig, maybe if it's okay, I'll just have the clerk read out the full amendment with the sub-amendment, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So it would read, the amendment would then read,
Microphone, please. Merci.
to the members of the committee and the ethics committee, commissioner for study, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
That sounds good to me.
That sounds good? Awesome.
That sounds good. So I would thank you, Madam Chair. So with that, I think that we have the unique ability as members of the Ethics Committee to demonstrate to all Canadians that we will do everything possible to shed light on this issue that has rocked the confidence of the government and has consumed headlines among radio talk shows and I see Facebook posts minute by minute on this issue to ensure that we get the answers that Canadians deserve. So I think in line with my friend from the NDP, I think in line with the intent of what the motion was meant to be is to shine that light, to make sure that Canadians get the answers that are required, so that we can have
list. I'm sorry.
Because the sub-amendment has been moved, yes.
Okay, so please put me on the list.
And so in seeing that there are members of the government getting on the speaking list, I would certainly like to hear what they have to say about this, and look forward to, I would hope in an expeditious way, see that we can begin the process of shedding light on what the many issues to come, because and I'll just end my comments with one more paraphrase of a conversation that I had on Tuesday, yesterday, with a constituent saying, specifically referencing the filibuster, because I was asked about, they were reading the news and saw that the government members were participating in this filibuster, and this constituent didn't really understand what a filibuster was. And at the end of the conversation, they said, well, why would they want to hold up getting to the bottom of this? And I think that's a good question. So with that, I would move the sub-amendment, which I hope is in line with the original intent of what my friends in the NDP have intended, to ensure that we can simply do that, get to the bottom of this. And the outstanding question is, why not? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. Folks, we have now moved from a motion to considering an amendment to that motion, and now we are considering a sub-amendment. With that, we begin a new speakers list for the sub-amendment. So first up, I have Mr. Barrett.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to Mr. Keurig for the for his remarks.
Please add me on the speaker.
Just one moment. You want on the speakers list? You want on the speakers list? Yes, you are on there already.
Oui. Est-ce qu'on peut me redire?
Could I please be told once again what the order is?
Désolée.
Désolé.
I apologize. Just so I can follow more easily, we have heard different names and we're adding some. I'd like to know in which order I am, where I am in the order of things. Thank you.
Sure, just one moment here. All right. For the sub-amendment, we are hearing from Mr. Barrett currently, then Madam Shanahan.
Excusez-moi, Madame la Présidente.
Excuse me, Miss Chair. It was a question. My name, I want to know where my name is. Am I in 4th place? Am I in 5th place?
Okay.
Mr. Barrett, Madam Shanahan, Mr. Green, Mr. Fergus, Madam Goodrow, Madam Briere, Mr. Currick. Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ms. Briere, every time I've spoken in this committee, you interrupt me within 10 seconds on a point of order to add your name to the speakers list. I find that fascinating. Just as Ms. Shanahan took opportunity at the last meeting to interrupt on points immediately after I started speaking. So just in the interest of collegiality and that spirit of collegiality we talked about early on, I won't be interrupting you ad nauseum and with a predictable cycle throughout your speaking at this meeting, but I do find it interesting. I do find that very interesting. The other members are able to draw attention, the chair's attention, without interrupting another member when making their remarks. In my letter dated July 13th to the clerk, I raised the point that it is concerning to think that payments might be funneled this way in order to secure government contracts with respect to the $300,000 paid to members of the Trudeau family by the We organization. And having visibility on speaking engagements that the family members have been paid for is germane to have an understanding of breaches that may have occurred. We have a situation where it is evolving minute by minute, and it's important to understand if organizations are using members of the Prime Minister's family to gain access to government. That's important. It's important to reiterate also that the issue is not with members of the Prime Minister's family being paid for their profile, be it for their work in a particular field or because of, in the case of Miss Margaret Trudeau, that she's the wife of a former prime minister. That would garner some interest on the speaking circuit for sure. But when we have this organization that was not paying other speakers and only paid speakers who were related to someone who could financially benefit their organization, it's important to understand how widespread this is. That's necessary. There's no intention, desire on my part or the parts of my Conservative colleagues to call any other members of the Trudeau family other than the Prime Minister. I don't think that is necessary. The personal information with respect to addresses, contact information, not germane. But with respect to speaking fees paid and speaking fees paid by whom, that is germane to the work of this committee. So I will be supporting the amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Barrett, thank you. Moving to Madam Shanahan.
Chair, thank you. And I just want to point out to Mr. Barrett that he certainly has had ample opportunity during the course of this committee and earlier meetings to speak at length and without interruption. So I think it is the business of all committee members here to participate to the fullest extent in the meeting, and I think it's the right of every committee member just to make sure that they're on the speakers list. And that
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Mr. Barrett.
Could I get myself on the speakers list, please?
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Thanks.
Ms. Shanahan.
Madam Chair, I'd like to talk to a few points to the sub-amendment. I think that there has been, we had thorough discussion at the last meeting about what the mandate of this committee was and about the different roles that this committee has. And I think that I made the point in my discussions at that point that the committee here, our role is to review the work of the officers of Parliament, the 4 officers that are included in our mandate. And I am wondering if indeed the sub-amendment is expressing some lack of confidence in the Commissioner of Conflict of Interest and Ethics. So I'd like to just share with the committee some notes that I made concerning the Commissioner, the Act, and the role that the Commissioner has in executing that act. So the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner administers the Conflict of Interest Act by establishing compliance measures, investigating possible contraventions of the Act, and providing advice to public office holders on their obligations. The Commissioner is an officer of Parliament. Officers of Parliament are independent from the government and report directly to Parliament. The Conflict of Interest Act came into force on July 9, 2007, which created, for the first time, a legislative regime governing the ethical conduct of public office holders. Prior to this date, public office holders were subject to non-statutory codes of conduct. And some additional information on the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner is that this person is appointed by the Governing Council by commission under the Great Seal after consultation with the leader of every recognized party in the House of Commons and after approval of the appointment by resolution of the House. He or she holds the office for a 7-year term. Under the Conflict of Interest Act, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner must be a former judge or superior court of a superior court in Canada or of a provincial court, or a former member of a federal or provincial board, commission, or tribunal who has demonstrated expertise in at least one of the following areas: conflict of interest, financial arrangements, professional regulation, and discipline or ethics, or a former Senate ethics officer or former ethics commissioner. The position was created in 2007 and replaced the office of the Ethics Commissioner, Parliament of Canada Act, Section 81. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner also provides confidential advice to the Prime Minister and to public office holders on all matters pertaining to the implementation of the Conflict of Interest Act. And in addition, the Commissioner may, at the request of a parliamentarian or on their own initiative, investigate any alleged breach of the Act by a public office holder. The Commissioner may, in the course of investigation, consider information provided by the public that is conveyed to the Commissioner by a parliamentarian. So I think that this information that is publicly available, I think is important for the Canadian public to understand that this is the role of the Commissioner of Conflict of Interest and Ethics, to undertake any investigation of alleged violations of the Conflict of Interest Act. And I would like to return once again to our mandate here in the committee, because many members here did cite the text of clauses 5, 6, and 7 during the course of their interventions. And I just want to point out, especially in 6, that the text must be read in its entirety. It's in a certain context. So in cooperation with other committees, the review and report on any federal legislation, regulation, or standing order which impacts upon the access to information or privacy of Canadians or the ethical standards of public office holders, not to investigate public office holders themselves. And this was very interesting to me as I was reviewing all of this, our statutory requirements here for this committee, because I took a look at the work of this committee historically. And I think it's something that behooves us to see how the important work of committee members actually leads to the creation and the evolution of better standards of practice.
So I would clarify with respect to the member opposite and the vice chair of this committee that much of the concern the members, certainly from the Conservatives and I'd heard from at least one of the other parties regarding the reference to the mandate of this committee. Conveniently, some of the sentences
point of order, or is this a debate?
Were left out. So I would just note that in reference to that, there was a number of times when members talked about the mandate of this committee. She's right; it does need to be read in its entirety, but in its entirety, not just select aspects of it.
Madam Shanahan.
Thank you. So returning to the work of this committee over the years, its early work before the creation of this committee was in the creation of a special joint committee on code of conduct. And then in the 38th Parliament, the mandate of this committee was studied at length. Which I think behooves us, as I say at the beginning of starting any work in a committee, is to know what the mandate is. Studies since that time related to disclosure of names of the access to information applicants. So again, looking at the appropriate execution of the legislation at the time. There was calling of witnesses in the Mulrooney-Schreiber affair, which was actually, there was a lot of testimony toward a full public inquiry. And to my mind, it points again to the fact that this is not the appropriate place for this kind of committee work, for this kind of investigation. Other work since then had to do with the estimates, Access to Information Act, naming of the different officers, including work and some of the more recent initiatives had to do with privacy and social media in the age of big data. And I think this points to the clause in our mandate which talks about initiatives. And indeed, some very good work was done. The growing problem of identity theft and its economic and social impact, as well as protecting Canadians' privacy at the U.S. border. And I think more recently in the 42nd Parliament, addressing digital privacy vulnerabilities and potential threats to Canada's democratic electoral process. And of course, the Report 20, the International Grand Committee on Big Data, Privacy and Democracy. So this is the kind of work that this committee undertakes. And it is coming to the sub-amendment. It is not for this committee to be receiving personal documents. That is the prerogative. That is the job. In fact, that is the very important work of the Commissioner, Conflict of Interest and Ethics, because this is the person that has been named at the agreement of all parties to undertake this work. It is not the work of this committee here. We are not an investigative body. Thank you, Chair.
Green, you are next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And you'll recall, as a recap, there was certainly lots of discussion about the mandate of this committee, about what our extent was. There was wild allegations that we were looking to drag Justin's mother, to the meeting, perhaps her relatives and family. And you'll recall that it was my colleague, Charlie Angus, who brought forward this compromise. That's what brought us here today with this amendment, which was to use the tools of the commissioner in this investigation to have the appropriate documents above and beyond what's been reported, because we'll recall that we already know through public record, $300,000 of pecuniary interest was transferred to family members and more. And so the compromise was to have this amendment essentially allow the private information of a private citizen to go directly to the commissioner. And in conversations with my friend who is providing the sub-amendment, recognizing the announcement of the Prime Minister to agree to go to the Finance Committee. I think there'd be a fair comment or feeling that the compromise that was put forward by my colleague might have been kind of dead in the water at that point, that the Prime Minister might not have been willing to attend 2 committees given the precedent. And so what this amendment does, and I'm hearing it for the first time, the sub-amendment, is it essentially brings us back to the original spirit of the amendment that the Conservatives had proposed originally, which is in fact not the compromise that we tried to provide. But I feel like, and if I could just be so plain as to say that this is now a game of chicken, because we believe that we were negotiating in good faith with our friends across the way in order to have accountability brought to this ethics committee. And so, being here and representing my good friend and the very learned colleague in Charlie Angus, I'm here to represent that original compromise and that original interest to allow for the Privacy Commissioner, the Integrity Commissioner to do their work in the investigation, provided there is support around this table to have the Prime Minister come to this committee. This committee is not the Finance Committee. This committee has a different mandate, and the mandate is very clear. It is an ethical mandate. There have been both financial breaches, as we've heard today from the Finance Minister's $41,000 forgetting of monies that should have been paid to this organization, and the many other ethical breaches that continue to unravel. But at the end of the day, our mandate here is to shine the light on this issue. And so I would like to hope that if there was goodwill around the table to support the original amendment as it was, then I would be willing to stick with the intention of the original amendment over the sub-amendment. Because in fairness, I am just hearing the sub-amendment for the first time. It's a very smart sub-amendment, by the way, because it brings it right back to where we are at square one. So through my comments, through you, Madam Chair, I want to hear from the other side. I want to hear from government if they are negotiating in good faith on a compromise before I make my decision on whether to vote for the sub-amendment or not. Because if they're operating in good faith and we were to vote down this sub-amendment, I'm going to speak very plainly, then the expectation is we would get support from the government side to support the spirit of the original amendment, which was to have the documents go to the Integrity Commissioner and have the Prime Minister called to this committee. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that the invitation is going to automatically result in his appearance. But this is about accountability. This is about integrity. So if there's games to be played, if there's future filibusters to be had, let's just be very clear. We can wrap this up very quickly. If in a few comments from the other side on government, they say, yeah, we'll support this amendment, as was the original spirit. We will negotiate in good faith with the New Democrats on this, on the amendment, then I won't support the sub-amendment. But if I don't get that, Madam Chair, if I feel like we're going to be filibustering, if I feel like, we're going to be into another, procedural shenanigan, then the public's watching right now. They'll see what's gone on in this committee. The public is not stupid, And so that's where we're at with this sub-amendment to my amendment that I'm bringing forward on behalf of my colleague. So I'm very curious to hear from the government side if they are willing to operate in good faith. We can vote on this motion. We can call the question on the amendment, and then we can call this meeting, to order and get on with things. Otherwise, we might be facing another filibuster, and we'll be right back to where we started. So that's where I'm at right now, Madam Chair. And where I'm from, plain talk is not bad manners. So I hope that in speaking plainly and clearly, that folks know what's on the table right now. And I hope to hear from the government side that they were operating in good faith and that we're not going to have another filibuster and that we can have this committee operate within its mandate and call this Prime Minister to testify before this ethics committee. Thank you.
Mr. Green, thank you. The next 2 people on the list are Mr. Fergus, followed by Madame Gaudreau. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Puis, merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues around the table. for giving us the opportunity to consider the proposal, the amendment and the sub-amendments, the compromise that was proposed at our last meeting. And I'm very beholden for this compromise. Before continuing my comments, Madam Chair, would it be possible if we could ask the clerk to reread the amendment that was proposed? The original amendment, that is Mr. Angus's motion to amend. If you could reread that, please, slowly and clearly, so that we can be absolutely clear on what we are discussing. And Madam Chair, if you agree, of course, I would like to resume my comments after that.
If she would mind reading, sorry, just to be clear, you just want Mr. Angus's original amendment without the sub-amendment,
That's
correct? Okay, I will ask the clerk to do that at this time.
That the motion be amended by adding after the words 1 week after the adoption of this order, the following, and that the clerk provide these records to the Ethics Commissioner for his study, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
Madam, could I ask another question? So when it is indicated that, according to that motion, that's amendment to the original motion, that information would go directly to the Commissioner of Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner.
The way that the amendment reads, based on Charlie Angus's motion, Mr. Angus's motion, or sorry, amendment, according to Mr. Angus's amendment, the way that it reads is that the information gathered, the speaking list gathered, would come to the clerk of the committee. It would not come to the members of the committee. Directly from the clerk, it would then be submitted to the ethics commissioner.
Is that what we all understand?
And the Prime Minister before the committee.
I got that. But,
Yes.
I just want to make sure that on that part. And the reason why, Madam Chair, why I sought that precision, just to make sure that it directly goes, is because it gets back to the principle which I raised at the last meeting. And if you'll just allow me a little bit of time to talk about that, my concern always had been was that why we set up the commissioner, the conflict of interest and ethics commissioner, was precisely the opportunity is that it takes it out of our hands. We have delegated this authority to act on behalf of all members of Parliament, regardless of political affiliation, to act in our better interest. Because sometimes it happens, I know all members are honorable, but even I am tempted every so often to play a political game. And I know, shocking as it is, Madam Chair, but it does happen to all of us from time to time. And when we're talking about these important issues, where we're talking about the finances or whatever background, I don't know, it could be a criminal issue, it could be whatever background that people might have, whenever we want to make sure that this information is going to the person who it should go to, and that is the person who's entrusted to act in a nonpartisan way on behalf of all of us, and that is the conflict of interest and ethics commissioner. So that's the reason why I sought out an understanding on that. With that, Madam Chair, rather, I have to admit I feel very comfortable with the amendment, and I feel still uncomfortable with the sub-amendment. My position hasn't changed on that. It's not said in the reason. I'm not trying to advance any political agenda on this. I'm really trying to think out, it's fine for this issue, but there's going to be other issues which are going to come out, and we don't want to cross the Rubicon on this one. We don't, to use another good Latin reference, we don't want to cross that Rubicon. We don't want to cross that river. We want to stay on this side. It's in all of our interest to do so. and it will be in the interest of subsequent generations of politicians because we're only here temporarily. Madam Speaker, I'd like to compliment Mr. Kirk for his opening comments today, for part of his opening comments today when he talked about where we find ourselves. We do find ourselves in a health crisis. We do find ourselves in a global pandemic. And I think Parliament has done a very good job at coming to the aid of Canadians in extraordinary ways, in ways which frankly make us the envy of the world. I really appreciate the proposed steps taken by the government that has been improved by members of the opposition to come up with things such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which I think is going to be playing an increasingly important role for making sure that our economy rolls back better. I appreciate the input that all members of Parliament have made. I know my colleagues on this side have made, and I certainly know that you've heard from your constituents on what we did in terms of old age security, what we've done with the guaranteed income supplement, what we've done with business loans. Toutes ces choses-là, Madame la Présidente, have bel et bien.
All of these measures have worked very well for all Canadians, many Canadians, so that we can, in fact, struggle through and get to the other side of this health crisis. People were allowed to not come to the office in order to cut the spread and transmission of this, and there's consequences to that. So we wanted to make sure that they can still be.
We are discussing a sub-amendment right now.
Yes, I will.
And so I would ask you to keep your comments to the sub-amendment, please.
I will do. I'm sorry, Madam.
Thank
I
you.
was just following up on what Mr. Kirk had raised at the beginning.
Yes, thank you. I don't mind you making a quick reference, but if
Excuse
it's
me.
the
Excuse me. I
full
will not make a
compilation of your
political
speech,
speech
then
on that,
I think
and it
it's
wasn't my
beyond the
intention.
scope of the discussion right now. Thank you.
It was not my intention to do so. Mais on avait.
That was not my intention. But so we've had an amendment to the original proposal made by Mr. Angus, and I'm prepared to support it. I believe that my colleagues would also be prepared to act so that we can limit it and ensure that the information will be transmitted directly to the Commissioner for Ethics and Conflict of Interest. And we would, of course, invite the Prime Minister to appear before the committee. I think that's an excellent compromise. It's something that I can support. I think that we can all support. And I would hope that the committee will reject the sub-amendment. If the sub-amendment is lost, I would be gladly prepared to go on to the main point that we're looking to do here, and what Canadians are expecting of us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes. The next two speakers are Madame Goudreau and Madame Briere. Madame Goudreau, the floor is yours.
Oui, merci.
Thank you very much. I'll take 5 minutes. The last time I spoke here before the committee, we had high expectations. We're at the Ethics Committee. So we have to be responsible, we have to be honest, we have to be transparent, and we had a pause. We put things on hold. It's nice to see each other again physically, even if we're socially responsible in our distancing. I was unable to attend the last meeting, but I noted many items that disappointed me quite seriously. Since the onset of this pandemic, we've been told we have to act rapidly, quickly, now, and we're going through an unprecedented event here. But what's happening here it's here itself in the committee where we could very, very quickly cast light on an issue. We all are capable of doing this and doing this effectively, efficiently, still satisfying people's needs and respecting the rules. So with everything that's been said, with all that we've heard, and the fact that I did, in fact, assist in the first two meetings of the Finance Committee, it's important to me new MP, and day by day, it changes our perspective of things. My electors have been asking me now over and over again, day by day, what's going on? What's happening here? Volunteer administrator, and yourselves, as much as I, are the first to disclose any conflict of interest. We're the first to do so when we feel that there is one. So how can, this is what I hear, they're not holding education nights for their kids, but millions of dollars here are being spent. So you are entirely correct. You cannot be a simple spectator of what is going on today. We have to be participants. So that's my 5 minutes. And as we're talking about the sub-amendment, I think that we owe it to ourselves to shed light on this issue. What is there to hide? We are, in fact, responsible and accountable. So I would appreciate Mr. Couric sub-amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Gaudreau. The next two speakers are Madame Brière and Mr. Couric. Madame Brière, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to raise 2 or 3 points, and I hope that Mr. Barrett won't take that personally. I am just learning from one committee to the next, and I know that my comments of last Friday made some people uncomfortable. Other members like to show that they can speak Latin, Hebrew, or Greek. So, as I said last Friday, it's important for the Commissioner for Conflicts of Interest and Ethics to get all the relevant information to analyze the file that we're dealing with. We have complete trust in the Commissioner. It's his role to give advice on things dealing with conflicts of interest, and it's also his mandate to investigate, whereas we're not an investigation committee and we're not a kangaroo court. So that's why we accept the part of the amendment of Mr. Angus and Mr. Green that provides that a copy of all documents be sent directly to the Commissioner. It's my turn to salute the introduction of Mr. Couric today. It's true that Canadians have to go to the bottom of this issue because we work for them. We work for all Canadians. And it is our priority, and it's always been our priority, especially since the beginning of this pandemic. Mr. Couric, on the other hand, claims that we haven't put the interests of Canadians first. However, with all the programs that we have set up, whether it be to help personally Canadians, individuals, or to help businesses with the salary subsidy that was adapted to meet the concerns of our business people during this crisis, whether it be through a program for commercial rent or to help seniors or help the handicapped or students. That program was created to help students, and right from the launch, there were 35,000 applications that were made, and they were coming from various regions. So we know that it was expected and necessary. So we acted quickly and efficiently. The figures show it. We've helped millions of Canadians with billions of dollars that were distributed to support everyone. We've even proposed a way of working in Parliament, allowing us to discuss bills, and this is an example that we respect democracy. And be reassured, I won't start again with the same speech as last Friday. So in this issue, the Prime Minister has apologized, and now he's ready and willing to answer the questions of the Finance Committee. Concerning the sub-amendment, I agree that the investigation should be done by the Commissioner, and he should be able to get all the documents that he feels necessary, and all this in confidence. So I agree with my colleague, Mr. Angus. Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Keurig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much again, Madam Chair. And I'll keep my responses very, very brief. And again, the question of the mandate of this committee has been brought up, and I would actually use the comments that Ms. Shanahan made in part in her speech on Friday, and it was that and I apologize if this isn't quite 100% verbatim. It was as fast as my shorthand could do, but it was, "We have wide powers of how to conduct our business," unquote, when referring to the committee. So again, the inference was that we want to turn this into a kangaroo court or go on a witch hunt, whatever the case is, and that is absolutely not the case. However, if the number of calls that I'm getting into my constituency office, emails, text messages, Facebook comments and messages, Canadians demand answers. And I believe it is incumbent upon us all to ensure, and I'll use another quote from Mr. Fergus's testimony on Friday, and it is that democracy is fragile. It is. And we've seen a shaking of the trust that Canadians expect to be able to put in their government, regardless of its political stripes. The ongoing developments and seemingly every time Twitter gets refreshed, there's a new revelation, a new element to the scandal that is being revealed. And certainly, from what I'm hearing from my constituents, is that if we don't do everything we can to restore the trust that Canadians expect to have in our Parliament and in their government, regardless of whether they voted Liberal or not, certainly we need to take every step necessary to help bring that trust back. So I would encourage all members to once again consider the question that was asked by that constituents that I mentioned with a phone call earlier this week. What is the problem with shining light on this issue? So certainly I'd encourage members to consider supporting the sub-amendment, but I'd sure like to see it go to a vote so we can continue to move on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. The next two speakers are Mr. Barrett and Mr. Vaughan. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
In the interest of moving to a vote, I'll cede my time. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Vaughan, followed by Madame Gaudreau. Mr. Vaughan, the floor is yours.
So thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to join this committee today to further explore the role of this committee in relation to what's in front of us with the amendments and the motions that have been moved. I'm going to start by just a bit of a background. When I was the city councillor in Toronto, one of the roles I fulfilled in David Miller's mandate was to appoint an ethics and an integrity commissioner. And one of the pieces of advice as we were formulating that office we got from several different bodies across the country, municipal, provincial, and federal, people with experience, was to be very careful about setting up politicians to investigate politicians. There's a political theater and a political process for that. But when you set up investigative bodies with competitors, with colleagues investigating each other, it very quickly becomes something which is unfair, both to those who are accused of wrongdoing, but also to those who are asked to participate in the investigation of colleagues, because it's impossible to divorce the ethical standards from the political behavior. And this doesn't give us good, strong ethical governance structure. It doesn't give us good, strong investigative results, and it doesn't give us clarity on what's being done wrong, what's being done right, and what needs to change in terms of the rules and regulations to make sure that democracy and good governance is protected. So the motion that's in front of us, I think, is understandable in terms of its intent to get information from private citizens transferred to the ethics commissioner, so that investigation of the situation that we find ourselves in can be appropriately done and reported back to Parliament. And the findings can be done through an independent system, which I think a previous Parliament wisely set up and put together. I think that's a really important principle, and I think that there is a gap in the way in which we operate because of the issues that have been raised here, family members and their role in the conflict of interest guidelines, and which family members and to what degree do we understand our family members' behaviors, and how does that impact us as public office holders. I think we need clarity around that. I think it's critically important, even without this issue in front of us, to maintain the confidence and trust Canadians have in the governing process. But when we set up a parallel investigative process, it is not unlikely that this body could reach very different conclusions from the Integrity Commissioner, and that calls the role of the Integrity Commissioner into question immediately. And that's not a good situation for those of us who rely on the Integrity Commissioner to clear our names or to deliver findings to us. It is not a good situation to undermine the integrity of that office while that office is doing critically important work on our behalf. And so I'm very reluctant to set up a set of precedent in this committee, which does not have a mandate of investigating any member of Parliament for any reason on a particular issue, to suddenly say this committee would then have the power to compel any member of Parliament to attend and suffer the political consequences if they decline the invitation. I think this sets a really dangerous precedent and sends this Ethics Standing Committee off in a whole new direction that it was never intended to deal with. We set up the Integrity Commissioner not to depoliticize what was happening, but to give us clarity in a political setting. And from there, how we choose to respond to the Ethics Commissioner, that is where this committee's work begins. And at that point, I would assume, having read previous Ethics Commissioner and reports on individuals, that the relevant information as to where the rules were broken, which rules were broken, why they were broken if they were broken, or what rationale that existed to frame the rules the way they were, and what proposals may be required to change that. That's when the work of this committee starts. But it doesn't start by investigating the individual simultaneously, regardless of who that individual is. It is very clear, if you read the mandate, the full mandate of this committee, that our job is to evaluate those reports and to make recommendations to Parliament on what changes need to be made to guidelines and conflict of interest regulations, so that Canadians can have confidence in Parliament. So I have complete support for Member Angus's motion to request this information be forwarded to the Ethics Commissioner. I think that's fine. I think it's massively premature to call the Prime Minister in this case in front of this committee while that Ethics Committee investigation is underway. I think that is a flaw in the way the amendment is drafted, and I also think it's it assumes a conclusion to the Ethics Commissioner investigation, that somehow we can start asking the Prime Minister questions in real time while that investigation is underway. I think that's clearly, it's like doing the investigation and the trial all at the same time. And I don't think that's an appropriate way to proceed. So I do support the motion to as I said, to the amendment in the spirit of Mr. Angus's motion. I am very concerned about calling politicians from the House, any MP from the House, in front of the Ethics Commission every time there's a political point to be made, because I think that sets a very dangerous precedent, and I can't support that at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Two other speakers that are on the list, and then it completes the speakers list for now. That is Madame Gaudreau and Mr. Green, starting with Madame Gaudreau.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. So what I've just heard concerns me too. And what I've heard during the last meetings of the Finance Committee has concerned me. We've just heard Mr. Monod, and we've just learned that Mr. Trudeau will come and visit us at the Finance Committee. And I don't understand what's going on here, because it's not a small political issue. It's not. This issue is not insignificant. So for me, it's important to tell you that there will be a motion that will be filed on my part, and maybe I can say it verbally, and we'll deal with it later on, Madam Chair.
An amendment or a sub-amendment, you are not able to move a motion.
Non, j'entends rien du tout.
I will do my best.
You can hear it.
Motion, an amendment or a sub-amendment, you are not able to move a motion.
Parfait. Ceci dit,
Perfect. So that being said,
notice that you plan to move a motion, you are able to give notice of that at this time.
préavis, ça veut dire que je peux la lire? Oui?
does that mean that I can read it? That I can read my motion?
Welcome to read your motion and give notice of it at this point in time, yes. But it cannot be officially moved.
Excellent. Donc,
Very well, so I will read it. It's a verbal motion. Given the avowals of the Minister of Finance that he received remunerations from We Charity and that he put himself in a conflict of interest, that the committee asks for his immediate resignation. Thank you.
Next speakers are Mr. Green and then Mr. Fergus. Last speaker on the list is Mr. Barrett. Mr. Green, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I deeply appreciate actually the candor of this discussion. I think it's very important for us to be open and honest with Canadians in terms of what our intention is when we enter into these good faith discussions, because it is a critical point. But I have to say, coming from City Council myself, that the size and scope of this type of scandal would have required probably an immediate censure, that there wouldn't have been a long and drawn out process, given the information that's already been made public, quite frankly, that the spirit of the motion was to have the Prime Minister here today. And what I've heard in the previous speaker's comments was that there's really no intention to have the Prime Minister join us here today, that in fact it's not part of what they think is the appropriate use and mandate of this committee. And what I'm not interested in, Madam Speaker, what I'm not interested in is the theater of the invitation. So what I want to be assured for is that when people are voting to support this invitation, from the Prime Minister to testify here that they're doing it in a good faith, where they actually believe, and they state on the record here today, that they believe the Prime Minister should testify at this committee, given our mandate. And if that's not present, if this is going to be the theater of voting for the amendment simply to get the documents subverted from this committee to the ethics and conflict of interest investigator, then that's not actually supporting the spirit and intent of the compromise, because it's not actually a compromise at all, in fact. So with that being said, I would love to hear from members opposite that they do believe that the mandate of this committee is to, much like any other committee, I'm on OGO as well, ministers are not backbenchers. This is not about dragging any old politician before a committee. This is about government. This is about cabinet. This is about responsibility. And quite frankly, I've said it before, apologies are not the same as taking responsibility. And taking responsibility demands holding accountability. This committee is structured to hold government accountable. So, through you, Madam Speaker, I need to be very clear, again, and plain in my language, that if the members opposite do not actually believe in the intent and don't support having this Prime Minister be before us today, then I will be supporting this sub-amendment, and we will bring the documents here. Because that's the spirit and intention of the motion that my colleague brought to this table. And I'm not here to play games, quite frankly. And so unless I hear from the opposite side that they believe the Prime Minister, much like he's doing in finance, much like ministers do...
Mr. Green, just pause for one moment here. Ms. Shanahan has a point of order.
I just wanted to know the speakers list.
That's not a point of order.
Sorry.
That's not a point of order.
Let me just clarify something for the committee. I don't mind giving the speakers list, and you'll note that I'm actually giving it to you as we move along. So I'm announcing 2 or 3 speakers at a time. And so I would encourage you folks to take your pen and write that down. It is not an appropriate point of order to ask for the speakers list, and I will not be answering that question any longer. An appropriate time to ask for the speakers list, if you wish to have it, would be when one speaker is finished and I'm moving on to the next. So there's a small pause there, and that would be an appropriate time to just raise your hand and take to the mic and ask for that speaker list. Mr. Green, you may continue.
Yeah, and I'll continue by picking up where Mr. Barrett left off. That is clear it's a tactic to disrupt, quite frankly. And if you've been in this House long enough, I've only been here 6 months, but that is clearly not a point of order. And so I just want to recognize that people are watching live stream, and they see the games that are being played at this committee. So again, I'll put to this committee, there is a sub-amendment on the table. The sub-amendment's tied to whether or not the Prime Minister is going to come here and testify. And unless I hear from multiple members of the governing party that they too believe that it's within the mandate to have the Prime Minister testify, I'm going to be supporting the sub-amendment. The math is very simple around the table. So I do appreciate the candor. And I would like to continue to state that, you know, if we end up in a filibuster and we're here, you know, I'm happy to dig in and we can continue this, because every single day that passes, more of this scandal comes to light by the media. So if that's your intention, to draw this out and to play these games, then fine. But if you don't believe that the Prime Minister should be here, then you ought not vote for the amendment, because that's not negotiating in good faith, quite frankly. And that's what we're here to do. We've tried to bring a compromise to this table. And we've heard quite clearly that there's no intention for the Prime Minister to come before this, because they don't believe that's the mandate of this committee. I happen to believe that it is, Madam Chair. So hopefully folks have their speakers lists written down, and I look forward to the continued debate.
Mr. Green, thank you. My speakers list, Mr. Fergus, Mr. Barrett, and Mr. Vaughan. Mr. Fergus, the floor is yours.
Very briefly, Madam Chair, I support the sub-amendment. Point. I'll say it again. Madam Chair, I support this. I support the amendment. Forgive me. I support the amendment to the original motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus.
And I will be voting in favor of the amendment to the original motion.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Barrett and Mr. Vaughan are next on the speakers list. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
I'll yield my time in interest of moving this to a vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Vaughan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, and I would like to start by apologizing because I think the way I phrased my argument gave rise to the concerns that I appreciate the point you're making, and the way I phrased it gave rise to your concern, and I don't want that concern to be sustained. So let me be clear. I, too, will be supporting the amendment. I have my concerns about how it times out and plays out based on the parallel investigation going on, but I also appreciate that members of the opposition wish to use the committee this way, and that's the prerogative of the committee. That's the prerogative of the committee, and the motion that's in front of us is the one that I have to vote on. So I can't split it and parse it and divide it. The point I was raising, and I think it's an important point, is how we do it matters. And I'm not evading and not suggesting that there shouldn't be this line of questioning doesn't have standing at the committee. It's how it plays out raises concerns for me, and it raises concerns because of the points I made earlier. But it's clear that the amendment as proposed is the right way to go based on the consensus of the committee, and I'm not trying to turn that upside down. And I apologize for raising that alarm because that wasn't the intent. But the point that was raised, I hope, and was made, was that we have got to make sure the Integrity Commissioner does their work and does their work with the confidence of this committee and is not undermined by looking like there's a parallel investigation going on. That was the point I was making, and if I didn't make it clearly enough, I apologize to my colleagues and I apologize to the committee, and I, in particular, want to assure Mr. Green that I will be supporting the Angus motion. And I hope that clears it up.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Mr. Green, you are last on the speakers list.
Thank you. And for the purpose of clarity, I'm going to be very clear. What I need to hear from the members opposite is that they believe the Prime Minister should testify in front of this committee, not they support the motion. I've been around and doing this long enough. You know, you make it in Hamilton, you know, you can make it anywhere. So what I want to hear is that they believe that it's the mandate of this committee to have the Prime Minister testify before us. Not just invite him. I'm not interested in invitations. I can invite the man to my wedding. It doesn't mean he's going to show up. I want him here. And so unless I hear from the members opposite that they believe, members, plural, that the Prime Minister should be here to testify under the mandate of this committee, I'll be supporting the sub-amendment. And that won't get any clearer. It doesn't mean you support the motion. That's not enough. I want to hear you say that you believe the Prime Minister should be sitting in that chair, being held accountable by this committee.
Madam Shanahan, last on the speakers list.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I, too, need to apologize in my enthusiasm earlier. I thought I had heard a question being put by the member opposite, and I wanted to answer that question, that I will be supporting the amendment. Thank you.
At this time, we will move to a vote on the sub-amendment. Yes, you may. I will first have the clerk read out the sub-amendment, and then we'll proceed to a vote.
That the sub-amendment of Mr. Courig reads that the clerk provide these records to the members of the committee and the Ethics Committee for study.
Sorry.
Do you want to?
Commissioner and the Ethics Commissioner. There was members of the committee and Ethics Commissioner.
And Ethics Commissioner for study, yes.
Sorry. Yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah, no.
Madame la greffière, est-ce que vous pouvez le lire?
Madame Clerk, could you also read it in French, please? Would it be possible to read it in French, please? Could you also read it in French? I don't have it in French.
But in front of her in French, it would be rather difficult to do. It's why we trust our interpreters to do that work for us. Thank you.
Pouvez-vous la relire?
Could you please read it once more, very slowly?
I'll ask the clerk to read it one more time.
that the clerk provide these records to the members of the committee and the Ethics Commissioner for study.
Thank you.
Ready for the vote?
Madame Bruyère. Madame Lalonde.
Ms. Lalonde.
Mr. Fergus. Mr. Vaughn. Madame Shanahan.
No.
Mr. Barrett.
Yes.
Mr. Gourd.
Wait.
Mr. Couric.
Yes.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
And Mr. Green.
Yes.
I'm just going to suspend the meeting just for a moment. Thank you. Thank you. I find myself in an interesting situation where, of course, I am expected to break the tie. And as the chair of this committee, I have reviewed the documents in front of me, including our procedure book and the expectations that are outlined there. I have also conferred with the clerk, and I have come to a decision. As the chair of the committee, it is expected of me to break the tie, one way or the other, of course. It cannot be sustained as a tie. I am not expected by the Green Book to give a reason for my decision. However, I will provide you with a reason here today. In the mandate set out for this committee, towards the end of the mandate, it says this: in cooperation with other standing committees, the committee also reviews any bill, federal regulation, or standing order which impacts upon its main areas of responsibility, access to information, privacy, and the ethical standards of public office holders. It may also propose initiatives in these areas and promote, monitor, and assess such initiatives. There's an important distinction here in terms of the mandate of this committee, and that is, yes, it will review bills and it will review reports that are brought forward by the 4 officers of Parliament. However, it may also propose, which is to say, create a new study or initiative in these areas and promote, monitor, and assess such initiatives, which would tell me that this committee does in fact serve as a body to promote, monitor, and assess the activities that take place by office holders within this place called Parliament. That said, it is for sure within the purview of this committee to monitor and assess the actions of those on Parliament Hill. The Prime Minister of this country, Mr. Justin Trudeau, is one such office holder. And so it is definitely within the purview of this committee to have him come here and to testify. The amendment that has been put forward requests that. The sub-amendment that has been put forward requests that a list of speakers be made available to the clerk, then to this committee, and to the Ethics Commissioner. My question is, as the chair of this committee, is it in the public's best interest that this would take place? Because ultimately, this committee is responsible to assess the actions and take on other studies having to do with public office holders and their conduct. And we do that not for our own sake, but for the sake of the Canadian public. And in this case, we are looking at just over $900 million that was committed to by the Prime Minister of this country and his cabinet. And that money was to be given to an organization to run a youth volunteer program. That $900 million is public funds. That is taxpayer money from the Canadian people. Therefore, I would surmise that the Canadian public does in fact have an interest in how that money was utilized. It has been suggested by the members of this committee, not all, by some members of this committee, that some of that money that was incorporated in that, not that was incorporated in the 900 million, but in previous interactions with We Charity, that some of that money, which also was public money, may have been used to fund the members that are on the speaking list that has been requested. Again, because that is public money, it is in fact in the interest of the Canadian public to understand how that money was used. That said, I will make my decision in the interest of Canadians from coast to coast. And I believe that what is in their best interest is full transparency. I vote yay. At this point, we move to a discussion on the amendment to the original motion. I would have the clerk then read out the amendment, which has now been amended. And then I will continue with discussion in just a moment, Mr. Fergus, if you may.
Madam Chair, I regret to do this.
Are you raising a point of order?
I am going to raise a point
Sure.
of order.
Mr. Fergus, go ahead.
And thank you very much, Madam Chair, for outlining your reasons for making the decision that you have made. I will be challenging the decision of this chair. And the reason why I'll be challenging this decision of this chair, Madam Chair, first of all, let me thank you for laying out your reasons. You didn't have to, and you did. But I think the chair, I would respectfully submit that the chair should have taken a look at of the Green Book, as you quoted it, section 609. Sorry, is it 608 or 609? I think it's 609. Where it says the chair, of course, as you just said, is not bound to give reasons for his or her vote and is free to vote either way. However, when bills being studied, the chair of legislative standing committees normally vote in such a way as to maintain the status quo or to keep the matter open for further discussion, just as the speaker would do in similar circumstances in the House. That is the only reference, again, to what we're doing. And so I would argue, and I will argue, as I do challenge the chair, that this does not permit the status quo, but indeed is breaking new ground for the Ethics Committee.
Mr. Fergus, I'm sorry. Thank you. Because it's not a ruling, it's actually a vote. In the same way that you wouldn't be able to challenge the vote of anyone else around this table, you are not able to actually challenge my vote as the chair.
Can I have a ruling by the clerk on that? I thought that just looking at that part of the procedure, which deals with what happens when there is a tie vote. And what happens in the conditions in which that a chair would actually cast a vote. A committee chair would cast a vote.
Well, if you just give me a moment, I'll ask the clerk.
Please, thank you.
Mr. Fergus, the clerk has declined to speak to this. However, it is confirmed that it is in fact a vote and not a ruling, and so unfortunately I'm not able to sustain your comments. Thank you. Mr. Keurig.
So I hesitate to bring up the speaking list in light of your comments earlier. However, I am curious, and partly I admit my relative youth in terms of my time in Parliament. I was on the speaking list when I moved the sub-amendment. Does that mean my time has expired, or do I have the opportunity to once again address? And I'll simply ask that simple question for clarification.
Mr. Keurig, thank you. So in just a moment, we will proceed to discuss the amendment. And according to my speakers list, Mr. Keurig, because you did last have the floor under the amendment, And the only reason why it went from you to others is because we entered into a discussion with regards to the sub-amendment. You are still technically at the top of my list with regards to the amendment, so it would come back to you. Now, that stated, maybe just before we get going in terms of our discussion on the amendment, Mr. Green, I see your hand, just a moment. Just before we get started on that, I will ask the clerk to read out the amendment as it now stands with the sub-amendment as a part of it.
Thank you. The amendment as amended reads as follows. That the motion be amended by adding after the words 1 week of the adoption of this order, the following. And that the clerk provide these records to the members of the committee and the ethics commissioner for study, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
Mr. Green, are you wanting to be added to the speakers list, or yes? Okay, no problem. You are already on there. So I will just review the speakers list before we continue forward. We have Mr. Keurig, Mr. Barrett, Mr. Angus, Mr. Green, Madam Shanahan, Mr. Fergus, Madam Gaudreau, Mr. Keurig. Oh, no, you're at the top, not the bottom. All right. With that, we will continue. The floor is yours, Mr. Keurig.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I will truly keep my my remarks brief and simply say I believe that the issue that we have at hand, it would be in the benefit of all for it to be moved expeditiously through these proceedings, so that we can not only get on with the further debate of this motion, but to ensure that Canadians are getting the answers that I believe, and as I've mentioned before, that my constituents remind me on a regular basis, believe that they should be getting. And I would reference again some of the comments that were made in the last committee meeting, and it's that you cannot do indirectly what you would do directly. It was Mr. Fergus that made those comments, and I believe that that is absolutely true. And certainly in the most transparent way possible, I would submit to all members of this committee, and those, I'm sure, the many who are watching these proceedings on Facebook and Parleview and whatever else the case might be. I clearly believe that Canadians deserve and demand answers on this, and that any action otherwise is doing indirectly what I would simply ask the members opposite to state clearly what their intent is in a delay. So with that, I would close my comments and simply say, let's get on with it. Let's get Canadians the answers they deserve so that we can move on to ensure that that trust that I referred to in my opening comments can be once again work towards that hard work of restoring trust in our institutions that need to be treated with such care, that we can work hard to restore that trust and get the answers that Canadians deserve. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. The next two speakers are Mr. Barrett and Mr. Angus, who, sorry, that is based on the first speaking list, so he is no longer here with us today, so I will take him off. So it is Mr. Barrett and then Mr. Green, starting with Mr. Barrett.
Hey, thanks, Madam Chair. I won't go on long. We're into hour 6 on this motion, and so we're on an amendment to the motion. And very much echo Mr. Keurig's comments. The situation changes almost by the hour with respect to new information that comes forward. So the will of the committee on the sub amendment was expressed, and so as I said at our last meeting, having heard from colleagues that there is certainly. There's certainly enough said that we can get to taking a vote. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. However, To pick up on where Mr. Green was before, if it looks like the speakers list will just be populated until we exhaust our room booking here today, I may make further interventions in hope that we do bring this amendment to a vote and the main motion to a vote certainly before the end of the hour. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Green, you are next on the speaking list. Following Mr. Green, we have Madam Shanahan.
So you'll recall that in my conversations around the sub-amendment, I was fairly clear about wanting to kind of get to the heart of the matter. We have an opportunity. We've certainly discussed this at length, and I think it'll be interesting to see how this conversation develops from here in terms of whether we're going to be in another filibuster situation or whether we're just going to call the question. And so I'd like to test the will of the committee and call the question on this motion and just get to the vote.
Mr. Green, thank you. I understand your enthusiasm and your desire to do that in the interest of time and, of course, in the interest of the Canadian public. However, at this time, I'm not able to accept that. Thank you.
That's fair. I have a comfortable chair. Thank you.
Madam Shanahan, you are up next, and then following you is Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say that I am disappointed with how this situation is evolving, given the very, I think, important discussions that we had at our first meeting around how this committee would conduct itself, and last Friday, in that personal documents of individuals should be handled with the utmost of care in all confidentiality and in privacy. I think that's part of the work that we are here to uphold, actually. And so I would move a sub-amendment that any examination of personal documents by this committee be done in camera.
Madam Shanahan, specifically, you are speaking about the documents that would be a part of the speakers list requested by this amendment, or sorry, by the motion.
Yes, and just to clarify, it's documents that we're asking for, not a speakers list. Oh,
that is the document
yes,
that is being referred to
okay.
is the speakers list.
Okay, so that yes, that any examination of those documents by this committee be done in camera.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Shanahan. At this time, then, we will move to debating the sub-amendment by Madam Shanahan. Mr. Keurig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I believe that this the sentiment being expressed by the member opposite has been discussed lengthily, so I would simply suggest that we move forward to a vote as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. Mr. Fergus.
Encore une fois, Madame la Présidente.
Once again, Madam Chair, I do not agree with the decision of the committee concerning the sub-amendment for reasons that I've very well explained already, so I won't repeat that. I believe that we're making a grave mistake because I don't know where this will end when we start asking for documents concerning the legal past of a member, or if we talk about the business past of a member of parliament to know what someone did in the past, if it has even small relationship with the government. So I think that we're creating a very bad precedent. I remain opposed to what we're doing now. I'm still in favor, and I was ready to support giving this information directly to the Commissioner for Ethics and Conflicts of Interest, because he's the one who does that type of examination. But where will this all end? This is a good question. And this runs the risk of ruining the reputation of honorable people or the reputation of their friends or family members. And I think that this should be left to the Commissioner for Ethics. Nobody can say that this Commissioner will hesitate in confronting the power, the government. For 2.5 years, he has shown, since he's been appointed, he has shown that he does not hesitate. He does not hesitate in any way to make a decision or to share his opinion and conclusions following an investigation. And it's better for him to do that instead of us. Asking politicians to supervise other politicians, where will that end? And can we be assured that we will be totally disinterested when we make that kind of study? It's a bad idea. Despite of all that, despite of the decision made by the committee, it is certain that I will continue asking questions regarding this, because I really do not agree with this. But if we want to limit the damages, the least thing that we can do is, as it was agreed when we created that committee in this Parliament in February, at least the least that we could do is to have a discussion in private, in camera, to make sure that we won't go too far. Well, we're already going too far, but that we won't abuse our responsibilities. So this is what I'm pleading to you. We should limit this and keep that information in camera. So this way, at least, if we can limit the damages that we run the risk of causing, that's what I would do. So I support the sub-amendment of my colleague.
Seeing no other speakers, then we will move to a vote. The vote then is that the any examination of the speakers list would be done in camera. If the clerk wouldn't mind just reading it officially.
The sub-amendment reads, and that any examination of personal documents by this committee be done in camera.
Okay. Okay.
It's
following the
So any examination of personal documents would be done in camera?
any examination of those documents or the documents that we're referring to in the
In the
motion
motion?
in the motion be done in camera. Of these documents?
The documents referred to?
Sure. Does that work? In the documents referred to
And the
by the
documents
motion?
referred to be done
Be done in camera?
in camera.
Okay. Good. You may. I'll ask the clerk to conduct the vote.
So all those in favor, please say yay when your name is called. All those opposed, please say nay when your name is called. Madame Brière. Madame Lalonde. Mr. Fergus.
Oui.
Mr. Vaughan.
Oui. Yes.
Madame Shanahan.
Oui.
Mr. Barrett.
No.
Monsieur Gould.
No.
Mr. Couric.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
No.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
On the sub-amendment delivered by Ms. Shanahan, we have 6 voting yes and 4 voting no. Therefore, Ms. Shanahan's sub-amendment stands. Moving then on to the amendment, Madam Shanahan, the floor is yours.
On to the amendment. Can you read it again for me, please? I'm sorry.
Sure. So I will have the clerk read the amendment now with 2 sub-amendments added to it.
So the amendment reads, that the motion be amended by adding after the words 1 week of the adoption of this order the following, and that the clerk provide these records to the members of the committee and the ethics commissioner for study, and that any examination of this committee of the documents referred to be done in camera, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Shanahan. My speakers list then is Mr. Fergus and then Madam Gaudreau. Mr. Fergus.
Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, I'll engage in a direct comment. I will be, even with this amendment, I still think it is the wrong move for us to make, and I will be voting against the amendment and then the main motion if it were to pass.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Moving down, we have Madame Gaudreau, and then following her, we have Mr. Vaughan.
Given what we've talked about, given what we've reflected amongst each other, given what we've shared, I think the time has come. I think we're ready to vote. I won't say any more.
Thank you, Madame Gaudreau. Mr. Vaughan.
Yeah, I would just, I'll be voting against it. I think the notion of a parallel investigation concerns me deeply. The integrity of the Integrity Commissioner and the work that that independent officer of Parliament does, I think, is profoundly important. And the idea that be competing opinions on interpretation of evidence simultaneously as that independent officer goes forward, I just think is wrong. And I think it undermines, as I said, a very strong ethical framework that Parliament has put in place to hold us accountable, because we know that that's unfortunately a necessary part of any parliamentary process. I wish it weren't true. The issue that is in front of us is how to, I would hope, make the ethical framework and the rules of conflict of interest and the rules of integrity clearer and stronger, so that future parliamentarians are framed with an independent and a principled way of finding information, assessing facts, and if necessary, taking action to hold members accountable. It was a deliberate decision of past parliaments not to have parliamentarians do this for good reasons, and I am deeply concerned about this. I don't think it's inappropriate to have the Prime Minister here, as I said in my comments, to answer questions as to what's happened. That's not the point I was making. The point I was making, and the concern I had, and the concern I still have with what's being decided here today, is this notion of a simultaneous parallel process to the Integrity Commissioner. What happens if this committee reaches a separate set of conclusions than the Integrity Commissioner? What does the Integrity Commissioner do? Have we not undermined the independence of that office? And I think we need to think about that not in the context of the current timetable or current framework in which we sit, but I think we need to think about that in the context of the next situation that comes along. Do we want independent oversight of parliamentary processes as they relate to both cabinet members and backbenchers, any member elected to the House of Commons? Or are we going to constantly have a committee which will be able to call a member, accuse a member, demand evidence of the member, display that evidence to the public, and then reach a conclusion that has no consequence whatsoever because the Integrity Commissioner hasn't been involved? There's a reason why the opposition parties went to the Integrity Commissioner first, because that's the process. That's the appropriate process. And that's the process we've agreed to as parliamentarians. We're changing that today. And we're not changing it based on strengthening an overall ethical framework or accountability mechanisms. We're changing it because there's information in the public realm, and there is a political opportunity to exploit that in a committee setting. Let's be frank about it. And of course, you're going to get pushback from a political perspective, but I'm not speaking here from a political perspective or from a partisan perspective. I'm speaking here as a parliamentarian who takes the issue of ethics and accountability extraordinarily seriously. And I support wholeheartedly the notion of an independent office of Parliament doing this work. There are all kinds, and history has shown us there are pitfalls to politicizing accountability instead of strengthening it. And this committee's job is not to go after members of Parliament. It's to set the rules by which parliamentarians are held accountable. And the decision of past parliaments was to very, very clearly put that in the hands of an independent Integrity Commissioner. And I have the confidence in that commissioner, and certainly over my experience as a parliamentarian over the last 6 years have seen, that they have the capacity and the fortitude to speak truth to the power that parliamentarians hold, and to hold us accountable through that process. And I have confidence in that, and I have a great deal of concern about the way in which this committee is reinterpreting its mandate, and in particular, the notion that there should be a parallel accountability process that could look very different from the one that gets delivered to us by the Integrity Commissioner, whose job it is to do a non-political, non-partisan interpretation of fact, present findings to Parliament, and then move forward with the accountability measures. I support, as I said, getting all the information to the Integrity Commissioner. I think that's fundamental to a good decision. But I don't support simultaneously delivering it to other groups of parliamentarians so they can go off and do their work in different committees. And so I have a great deal of reservation as to some of the decisions being made here today, irrespective of which party we're talking about, irrespective of what issue we're talking about, from a process, from an ethical process, from a legal process of how we're handling this issue. And I just will end with this. God help you if you find yourself in a situation where parliamentarians are suddenly swirling around your behavior. and you no longer have access to an independent ethics commissioner. Instead, it's just a partisan committee. That is not a good practice to be establishing, and I have made my point.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Mr. Fergus, you are last on the speaking list.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I spoke a little precipitously. I will be voting for the sub-amendment, but for the amendment, but I'll be voting against the main motion in the end.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Excellent. Seeing no other speakers, I will move to a vote on. Yes, I will move to a vote on the amendment. At this point in time, I will ask the clerk to read the amendment as it stands and then proceed to a vote.
That the motion be amended by adding after the words 1 week of the 1 week of the adoption of this order the following, and that the clerk provide these records to the members of the committee and the ethics commissioner for study, and that any examination by this committee of the documents referred to be done in camera, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters. All those in favor, please say yay. All those opposed, please say nay when I call your name. Madame Brière, Madame Lalonde, Mr. Fergus, Mr. Vaughn,
Oui, yes.
Madame Shanahan,
Oui.
Mr. Barrett,
Yes.
Monsieur Gould,
Oui.
Mr. Couric,
Yes.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, based on the vote that was just taken with regards to the amendment, all 10 members of this committee vote yay. At this point in time, we will proceed to our discussion of the motion as it stands amended. I will now have the clerk, who has been so gracious to us, I might add, read the motion with the approved amendment. Once the clerk does that, the speaking list that has been preserved from last day is as follows. Madame Gaudreau, Mr. Couric, Mr. Fergus, Madame Brière, and Madame Shanahan. Sure.
Could you share with me what the procedure would be following this vote?
Following the vote on the motion?
I'm assuming that there'll be the debate on the motion with the speaking list that you have just outlined.
Yes.
Then I'm assuming that we'll come to question. What will happen subsequent to it coming to question?
Well, Mr. Fergus, I'm not able to tell you where that vote will land. But once the vote is completed, which is what I'm assuming you're asking, once the vote is completed, then if the motion passes, then of course this committee would have the responsibility to determine a witness list and so forth. We would move forward. The clerk, of course, would call for those documents as outlined in the motion. However, of course, if this motion does not pass, then you are all free to go on your way, and that's that.
The reason why I asked, Madam Chair, is that given that we have passed the time that was scheduled for a regular business meeting, and of course there was a motion on the table, so it needs to be considered.
Correct.
Following that motion, would there be an automatic adjournment? and moving to the subcommittee or subcommittee business that was also planned to be taking place starting at 6 p.m.
It is to the will of the committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm reading the main motion as amended. That pursuant to Standing Order 1083H, the committee review the safeguards which are in place to avoid and prevent conflicts of interest in federal government procurement, contracting, granting, contribution, and other expenditure policies, and that to provide a case study for this review, an order of the committee do issue to Speaker Spotlight for a copy of all records pertaining to speaking appearances arranged since October 14th, 2008 for Justin Trudeau, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, Margaret Trudeau, and Alexandra Trudeau, including, in respect of each speaking appearance, an indication of the fee provided, any expenses that were reimbursed, and the name of the company, organization, person, or entity booking it, provided that these records shall be provided to the clerk of the committee within 1 week of the adoption of this order, and that the clerk provide these records to the members of this committee and the Ethics Commissioner for study, and that these documents, and that any examination by this committee of the documents referred to be done in camera, and that the committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau, the floor is yours.
Quel bonheur.
How lovely to be able to speak so much, but in such short intervals. If I understand correctly, we have taken the time to look at all angles what's going on, and given that unanimously we've succeeded in moving forward, I have a wish, my wish, because we are also human beings, my wish is to have openness in deliberations before we vote. But please, I think we could bring something new to the table and not say again what has already been said at our last 2 meetings. I know we're able to do that. And I'd like to give up my time because I'm ready to vote.
Moving down the speakers list, we have Mr. Keurig.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I too would acknowledge the breadth of which the discussion has already taken place, and would cede my time in order to proceed to a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Keurig. My next speakers then are Mr. Fergus, Madame Briere, and Madame Shanahan. Mr. Fergus.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much once again. I will once again raise my opposition to what we're doing, and I think I have parliamentary reasons to support this. When you take a look at the selected rulings of Speaker Milliken, you will find a number of rulings which would indicate, several examples that would indicate of committee reports that are exceeding the scope of their committee's mandate. You can find those rulings, Madam Speaker, as as it was brought to my attention over this weekend, from pages 774 to pages 799, of a number of rulings that Speaker Milliken had issued saying of when committees have exceeded their mandate. I won't review them here. I won't waste your time. But I think it is really important that when you take a look at those rulings, you'll see that all of them talk about what is the mandate of this committee. And it is really important, and I'd like to point out near the end of that selection of readings on page 778, he says, like all other powers of standing committees, a power to report is limited to issues that fall within their mandate or that have been specifically assigned to them by the House. In other words, Madam Chair, the mandate of the committee limits not only the scope of the committee's report, but its study, but also the scope of its power to send for persons and papers. We are exceeding our mandate here today. Now, Madam Chair, I know you did not issue a ruling. I would request that perhaps you may want to take a minute to confer with the clerk, but based on that citation, I would love to have a ruling from the chair as to whether or not you think that this main motion, if it should pass, be considered, does it fall within or without, inside or outside of the mandate of this committee?
Mr. Fergus, thank you. That has been brought to my attention, my own attention actually, due diligence on my own part as chair. And I have conferred with the clerk and done my own research. And I appreciate you referencing those pages. I trust that that's from the 2017 edition.
Well, this time we the selected decisions of Speaker Middleton, so it's not necessarily the House the rules of procedure from 2017. It's actually
but just, from his decisions.
It's
awesome.
From his...
That's good clarification. Thank you. And so, having reviewed that, I would say that this motion is in fact within the scope of this committee.
So that would be your ruling.
I haven't been asked to rule on this.
I will be asking that you would rule on this in light of the selected readings of Speaker Milliken, pages 774 to 799.
Just give me one moment.
Thank you.
We're just going to suspend for one moment, please. Thank you. Mr. Fergus has asked me to make a ruling with regards to whether or not the motion is admissible. I have conferred with the clerk on this matter once again and have concluded that it is. The reason why I conclude that it is within the mandate of this committee is based on Standing Order 1083H7. Pursuant to Standing Order 103H, the committee is able to review the safeguards which are in place to avoid and prevent conflicts of interest in federal government procurement, contracting, granting, contribution, and other expenditure policies as outlined in the motion. Under this Standing Order 1083H7, it says that the mandate of this committee includes the proposing, promoting, monitoring, and assessing of initiatives which relate to access to information and privacy across all sectors of Canadian society and to ethical standards relating to public office holders. Given that that is a part of the mandate of this committee, I see no reason why the motion does not stand. Therefore, I am ruling it as within the purview. I have Madame Briere.
Nothing to add, Madam Chair.
Sorry?
Sorry, nothing to add. Thank
Oh,
you.
nothing to add. Thank you. Madam Shanahan then is the last person on my speaking list.
Nothing to add.
All right. Having gone through all of my speakers then, I will now move to a vote. We may. Do I dare put you through?
Can we just say on the main motion as amended?
We will vote on the main motion as amended.
All right. All those in favor, please say yay, and all those opposed, please say nay when I call your name. Madame Bruyère.
No.
Madame Lalonde.
No.
Mr. Fergus. Mr. Vaughn.
Nope.
Madame Shanahan.
No.
Mr. Barrett.
Yes.
Monsieur Gould.
Oui.
Mr. Couric.
Yes.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
Following the vote on the motion as amended, we have 5 in favor and 5 not in favor. I will now suspend for just a moment. Thank you. back. Having determined that the motion is within the purview of this committee and that it is in the best interest of the Canadian public for there to be transparency around this matter, I vote yay. Mr. Keurig, I will, yes.
Yeah. I would like to move an additional motion, or do I need to wait until the vote is read? Or the results?
Sorry? We are done with the one motion, and
Yes.
I've acknowledged you, so you can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would move an additional motion of which I have copies, which I would be
Point d'ordre,
happy
Madame la
to-
Présidente.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Is the entitled to present a motion at this time? Because I indicated a notice of motion verbally that I did have a motion I would like to make.
Procedure, you would need to raise your hand in order to officially move your motion. Thank you. Acknowledged. Mr. Keurig. Sorry, actually, I'm so sorry. Madam Gaudreau, you actually cannot move a motion on a point of order. So once Mr. Keurig is done, you are welcome to put your name on the speaking list. At that point, when you're called upon, you are able to move your motion. I will put you on the speaker's list, Madam.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair, previously I understood that once we were to be finished the procedure this evening for the Angus motion, that I would be the next one up.
According to procedure, it's just simply not the way that things work. So you may have been led to believe that. However, as the chair, I am my role, my responsibility is to keep this community function or this committee functioning according to procedure. Mr. Keurig.
même si c'est... On commence, là, on apprend. C'est-tu normal, ça? It's normal.
La motion était déjà...
Yes, but she already gave a notice of motion. You can't accept another one.
This committee, and so you are not able to raise a point of order. However, if you wish to be put on the speaking list, you are welcome to raise your hand and I will acknowledge you upon your turn. Mr. Keurig.
Madam Chair, just on a point of information,
Which doesn't exist, but yes.
point of order.
Yes, Mr.
Can you confirm if Mr. Keurik's motion, if he gave notice of motion prior to the meeting?
I can. As all of you are aware, Mr. Keurig does have a motion that prior notice was given for. Now, Mr. Keurig has not been afforded the opportunity or the luxury of being able to read his motion, so I am not yet sure as to whether or not is the one on notice. However, if it is, then I'm able to let it stand. Mr. Keurig.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I do appreciate the opportunity, and certainly there are elements to the procedural realities of Parliament that I am also getting used to. Now, for the benefit of the clerk, it is the same motion that was circulated. Those had been freshly printed, and my hands were recently sanitized. So it is the same motion that would have been circulated, I believe, last Wednesday afternoon, if my memory is correct. Sure. I'll be happy to hold on for a brief moment. Yes. Thank you very much, and many thanks to the clerk. And let me take this opportunity to thank the clerk and all those who during these challenging times work diligently to make sure that Parliament can function. They are to be applauded for their efforts, from the security to the staff that run the buildings to those who deal with the legislative matters. So thank you very much for that. Madam Chair, I would ask, I'm happy to read the motion into the record. However, as it was distributed and has now been once again distributed, I would have a number of comments, but if it is allowed to stand as presented.
Are there any committee members that would wish for Mr. Keurig to read the motion into the record? Excellent.
Okay.
Then it stands as written before you. Mr. Keurig, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Each day, each hour, and it seems like today, each minute, more is revealed about the growing WE scandal. We have stunning revelations from the Minister of Finance today. We've had, of course, much conversation about the Prime Minister's actions. We have had inferences and references to other members of Cabinet who have connections to this organization or have been lobbied by this organization, and in some cases, maybe even lobbied without that having been done in the manner which is prescribed by the relevant acts. I believe that, as I have mentioned before, that Canadians deserve answers on this. And this motion is very simple. And I would encourage all members to consider it our duty to see that those members of Parliament who have been appointed to Cabinet, hold the highest and most powerful offices in our nation, that they would be asked to simply spell out what they know, so that we as a committee can review and Canadians can understand what there is to see here. We have a strong tradition in this country to ensure that executive government is held to account, and that's done through Parliament and its structured committees. Now, Madam Breer had mentioned at some length last week about the stereotype that is given politicians. And certainly when I started the journey of getting into public office midway through last year, I got into politics understanding that there is a certain stereotype that exists. A stereotype, according to one Reader's Digest article that I read, was one of the least respected professions, only above that of lawyers. And maybe there's a correlation between lawyers often being politicians. I am not a lawyer, but it is a stereotype that I work diligently to break, to be transparent, to be open, to be honest, and to ensure that Canadians are well served, and specifically the 110 or so thousand people that live in Battle River Crowfoot, that they are well represented, that they can trust, and that they are served by me in the and the honor that I have to briefly hold the title as the Member of Parliament for Battle River Crowfoot. I don't take that for granted one day. That's why I fought so hard to see, albeit modified, but fought to see Parliament resume. Because I've been very disappointed with much of how the parliamentary procedure has taken place over these last number of months. Now, in the interest of time, I would just make a couple of small comments. One, I find it very interesting that a number of members of this committee have referred to the job of the Ethics Commissioner, of which I have the utmost respect for. However, in previous comments, Mr. Vaughan specifically didn't refer to this, but the other members did. And I find it tragic, actually, that a number of members said that it is the committee's job to review the reports of the Ethics Commissioner. Yet, a number of months ago, right prior to the COVID pandemic breaking out and seeing Parliament greatly changed, we are seeing that that members of the government voted against having the Ethics Commissioner come to this committee to explore one of his reports. I believe that it is in the interest of Canadians to do everything possible to shed light on this issue. Certainly, I can imagine that there are many members within government that are trying to figure out a strategy to deal with the ever-evolving WE scandal, but as certainly a member of the opposition, and I would encourage all members of this committee to truly look at this as an opportunity to have all members of Her Majesty's government in this country to shed light on the connections that they have. This is not meant to be anything other than that proactive disclosure, which we have seen, unfortunately, not done by certain members of those who hold cabinet positions. There is the ability for Canadians to understand what their government is dealing with, to trust that the dollars are being spent in the right way, that we have that relationship between members and their constituents. All of those things depend on that subject that I talked about before, and that's trust. I would simply say this: let's take every effort possible to help restore trust in our institutions, and let's shed light on this scandal so that we can get the answers that
whether or not this motion is in fact admissible. So, if I may, to the will of the committee, I would suggest that we adjourn the meeting and suspend the debate. We would then pick it back up tomorrow, at which point we would be entering into committee business once again. And so, Madam Gaudreau, you would have the opportunity to move your motion. Do I hear any objection?
Just so clarification on the timing then, because we had scheduled a subcommittee meeting, so that would fall. And
correct. Yeah. So because it's now 7:15 p.m., we've missed the opportunity that we had for subcommittee. And so what I would look to do then is bring back committee tomorrow. Hopefully we can move through committee business fairly efficiently, and then we would be able to do our subcommittee meeting tomorrow.
I didn't mean to co-opt you.
Yeah, can we have a timeout? Yeah, just about timing. Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to suspend just for one moment.
There's lots of things that I need to learn and trying to read.
with all due respect, I think this motion deserves all the attention that it merits, that we, I can see the reason for the adjournment, and that we propose, that we let our whips work together to propose an appropriate date.
Sorry, it's really hard for me to hear.
Oh, my goodness, yes. So used to it now. Yeah, so, so we have substitutes with us today. We have no idea what anyone's availability is, so if our whips offices can work together to come up with an appropriate date, we adjourn now and come up with a date to reconvene.
I'm, as the chair, I'm not able to commit to a specific time. However, I'm not able to commit to a specific time. I'm not able to make any promises to the committee members here today. Simply what is on the floor right now is whether or not we wish to adjourn this meeting and suspend the debate and reconvene, or if we wish to continue going forward.
Yeah.
So seeing no objection to adjourning. I'm sorry? We're going to put it to a vote as to whether or not to adjourn?
If it requires a motion, I'm happy to move it. If it does not, I'm happy to withdraw.
Mr. Green, I will acknowledge you. You can move a motion.
Nice. Give my name in the record books here at the committee. I move that we adjourn. It will be the most popular motion.
All in favor? Oh. Show of hands. Yes? Okay, awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. That concludes our meeting. We will see you again soon.